is Chicago's very own WGN News.
It's been a few whirlwind days, just 4 days since President Trump took the oath of office, promising to undo changes by the previous administration. He's done that with dozens of executive orders. He's also threatened allies with tariffs as he pushes his America First agenda. Professor of Political Science Suzanne Chad joins me now to talk about so many changes. Suzanne.
It's sort of like my students and I joke, it's like a fire hose to the face, American politics lately. That's kind of how the last couple of days feels.
Exactly. Let's talk about the fact that he's frozen all civil rights cases. Some may call that racist.
You know, what's so interesting, Micah, about that point you just made is that I think that President Trump and his allies would make the case that having that division of the federal government in the first place is a form of racism. And I think it's important to know that this and some incarnation of this division of the federal government goes all the way back to FDR, a different incarnation under Eisenhower, really reaffirmed under Johnson. This is not a new division of the federal government, but it does, what it does signal is that we are not an equitable democracy. And by getting rid of it, what it shows is that there's not a recognition of that or any kind of way in which we can make amends for it.
He has shut down the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. We just had a school shooting the other day in Nashville, Tennessee. What does that mean?
Yeah, you know, I've been thinking a lot about where the rollbacks are. And of course, some of it comes from promises on the campaign trail, donors, allies, sort of party platform. But this one in particular, what I think, in addition to all of those things, shows us is that President Trump is trying to roll back initiatives and cut spending so that he can fund other initiatives and what he would deem as more important initiatives. And trying to cut down on gun violence and mass shootings in our schools is not one of those things that he thinks requires funding.
Federal judge today talked about birthright citizen executive order. He ruled it unconstitutional. How can he do an executive order if it goes against the Constitution? The 14th Amendment, I think.
You're exactly right. There's 5 parts of the 14th Amendment. Birthright citizenship is one of those parts. And one of the things about executive orders that's very clear is that it cannot run counter to the Constitution or an existing law. That executive order bypasses both of those things. I think it's meaningful that this judge, in the strong language that he used, says and suggests that in no way, shape, or form is this executive order constitutional. Of course, it will be appealed. I suspect this will go to the Supreme Court. But I think that how the court rules is really a reflection of the legitimacy of that institution and the strength of our Constitution.
He spoke virtually, or by video, I should say, in Davos, Switzerland, and telling everyone they need to invest in the U.S. or face tariffs. And it got a positive response, didn't it?
It did. And I think part of this is because there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what tariffs are. One of the biggest Googled question right after the election was, what are tariffs? And when we've had economic downturns in previous decades, part of it was because of an over-reliance on tariffs. But it sounds good the way that he talks about other countries will pay and the consumer will pay less. But that is actually not how tariffs work.
There have been a lot of controversy surrounding his nominee or candidate for Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, the Fox TV News correspondent, or should I say anchor host. And a lot of people are saying they're going to, some say they're not, but it's a pretty good thing that it's, well, I should say, a pretty done deal that he's going to be accepted, right?
Yeah, it just came out that Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski were planning to vote no, and President Trump has gone after them previously when they had questions over previous nominees for other things. Of all the nominees, I think he's the one for good reason that is getting the most pushback, both for personal issues, but also his level of qualification for this position. But this Senate is willing to roll over on pretty much everything that their president puts forward.
Some people may be scratching their heads about this executive order, that he is asked to declassify the records related to the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. Why would he do that?
So this one is interesting. There's a sort of more fringe part of the further right of the Conservative Party, ones who very much believe in conspiracy theories that have all kinds of ideas about who assassinated JFK, also who assassinated Martin Luther King. And so I think he's playing a little bit into those suspicions and conspiracy theories by wanting to declassify them. It doesn't mean anything other than we would have whatever information is in there, but I think it speaks to that sort of fringe part of the further right base.
Got you. Professor Suzanne Chad, always great talking to you and giving us so much insight. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Mike. I appreciate it.